Thanks for coming along tonight, where Nick Kaldas is here on the occasion of the publication of his book, Behind the Badge, Do Good Work, Live by Your Beliefs, Fear No One, which has just come out. Now, he's well known to many of us, but I'll introduce him briefly. He served 35 years in the New South Wales Police Force, the last 10 as the Deputy Commissioner. His career was mainly in major and organised crime investigations and counter-terrorism, but it included a period as head of the homicide squad. But Nick Kaldas has also held a number of important international roles, including Deputy Chief Advisor with the coalition forces in Iraq in 2004, overseeing the rebuilding of the Iraq Police and Security Forces, Chief of Investigations in the UN Special Tribunal for Lebanon, 2019 to 2010, investigating the assassination of the former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri and a number of other assassinations, and the Chief of Investigations for the UN OPCU investigation into the use of chemical weapons in 2016. But tonight, on his many and varied career, Nick's going to talk to us about being behind the badge. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and welcome to all our friends watching electronically from home. Distinguished guests, ladies and gents, it's great to see some old friends here, and I'm really happy that all of you, so many of you turned out today. I'm a little bit surprised. But I just want to particularly thank Gerard and Anne and the Sydney Institute for having me. It's this opportunity to speak here tonight. I'm certainly humbled. I've just signed the book for the people who have spoken here, and when you look at all the dignitaries that have been through here, I'm not sure I really belong in this company. But my connection with Gerard goes back almost 20 years to the day when I first was promoted to Assistant Commissioner for Counter-Terrorism. It's 20 years ago, and Gerard asked to interview me, and I remember being really flattered that someone like Gerard would see me back then as someone who was worthy of an in-depth interview. I think we had a good couple of hours and covered a whole lot of topics and solved the problems of the world, which was wonderful. I just also want to apologise. I have been in London for a board of a company that I'm on, and you may have noticed Heathrow Airport shut down. I actually didn't think I was going to make it. So I was 48 hours behind, really, trying to get home. I got home this morning, literally a few hours ago, so I don't look my best. I've had a shower, so I don't smell anymore. And hopefully I won't put anyone to sleep. But I thought I'd speak to you about a few themes, if you like, that hopefully would come out of my book. Broadly, I want to mention why I wrote the book, my journey as a young migrant kid from Egypt, and then discuss the various roles I've held, both in Australia and internationally. Why I wrote the book. I have a dear friend called Bob Baer, B-A-E-R, who you might want to Google at some stage. He's ex-CIA. He's written 5 or 6 books now. He was the head CIA person in Lebanon throughout most of the Civil War. He's been there and done it all. I mean, his story is just amazing. He wrote his first book. They call the CIA the company. So the book is called The Company We Keep, which was then made into a movie called Syriana. And it's Bob's life story. And George Clooney plays Bob Baer. I need to stress, Bob Baer doesn't look anything like George Clooney. We've had an interesting discussion now that I've written this book with a lot of my former colleagues from police who are basically affectionately known as smartasses, trying to guess who would play me if they made it into a movie. And I Danny DeVito was mentioned, but I don't know. But anyway. So Bob Baer inspired me, as have other friends as well. Gary Jubilant is a dear friend who's written 2 books now, former homicide investigator. What Bob said to me, it's not all for you or all about you. It's about your kids, your wife, and all your loved ones. Police don't normally talk about themselves, and we certainly don't go home at the end of a shift, if you've been in homicide or the armed hold-up squad or whatever, and tell your family what you've seen and what you've done and what you've been through. And that's even more so with some of the jobs I've had overseas, investigating chemical weapons in Syria or the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister. You don't come home and sort of tell, oh, you should see what I've done today. I think it's against the Australian way of life, really. We don't do that. And cops in particular don't talk about this stuff. You don't brag. It's seen as bragging if you say anything. So what Bob said to me is he dedicated his book to his kids and said, I hope this goes some way towards explaining where the hell I was. he did miss out on a lot of their childhood. I don't think I did anywhere near as much, but I felt that by writing the book, and it was a torturous experience, I have to say, 3 years plus, and you have to go back and check everything and make sure that everything's, the facts are right and the dates and quotes and everything else are all accurate. Bob Carr, who you would all know, our former Premier, gave me some advice some time ago and said, Nick, you must go back and check everything because human memory is fallible. And he said he could have sworn some things, he's written I think 4 or 5 books, you go back and he could have sworn it was black, but he checked and it was actually white. So I was very conscious of that. I did dedicate the book to my kids, and I hope it tells my kids and grandkids and great-grandkids and the community generally, just some of the places I've been, what I've learnt, and our journey, if you like, from Upper Egypt to Cairo and then from Cairo to Sydney, and then the rest is you'll read in the book, and I hope you all buy a copy. I guess one of the things that has struck me over the many years in my career is that family are really it's really what it's all about in many ways. That's what shapes you. They're your anchor. I have a friend who's on another board with me, an English fellow who's former Special Forces, British SAS, and he is a former regimental sergeant major. He's been in every major battle in the last 20 years, Iraq, Afghanistan, and anywhere else where they've gone. His picture of him in uniform, enormous amount of medals on his chest. I'm really proud to call him a friend, and he's very proud of himself, obviously, as well. But he tells the story about how he said his last commanding officer said to his wife at a medal ceremony where he's this really impressive series of medals and regimental sergeant major and so on, and his commanding officer said to his wife, did you ever think in your wildest dreams that Vince would achieve all these things? And she looked at him and said, Vince has never featured in my wildest dreams. I think they do. They keep you grounded, don't they? The family. Now, I just wanted to mention, talk about rather, why I joined the police. And a lot of people have said to me, why did you join? I joined in 1981, so it's 45 years now, gosh, something like that. It's really scary. I can tell you there weren't many migrants in the police at that time. But I've reflected often, and certainly when I was writing the book, on why I joined. And I had to say something about it, obviously, in the book. And I think it's a desire to serve, to make a difference, to serve the community. And I hope throughout my service that I would serve as a role model for young men and women, particularly from migrant backgrounds. It might inspire them to join and to rise, to contribute to them realising that there should be no glass ceilings. If I can do it, anyone can, and they're not meant to sit there and say, well, I'm not going to apply for this, I'm not going to go for that, because it's not been done before. And we'll talk about some of the firsts that I think that have happened. Mike Julian, who's a very dear friend, is former Deputy Commissioner from NYPD, and some years ago he was the head of security for Westfield shopping centres. And I don't think he'd mind me telling you this, but he's he thinks philosophically about everything. He's a deep thinker about some of the issues that we all face. And he used to tell me that in his assessment, joining the police, and for him it certainly was, and I think probably for me subconsciously, it's about a desire to stand up to bullies, to right the wrongs, to help those who can't help themselves. And it's particularly so for people who are doing criminal investigation and major crime investigations, armed robberies, rapes, murders, people who cannot simply right the wrongs or fix things for themselves. And I think subconsciously, if not consciously, that's why a lot of us join. They're certainly altruistic. Most of us stay altruistic, some run off the rails, as we know. My career, as Gerard said, has mainly been in, and it's by choice, mainly been in homicide, armed robberies, organised crime, and in the last sort of decade or so, counter-terrorism and related issues. I don't regret any of that, and I'll talk about that, but it is a bit of a contact sport. You're locking people up and upsetting people sometimes. You're not dealing with happy customers all the time. And you do get complaints, and you do get people, saying nasty things about you. One of the highlights, if you can call it a highlight of my career, was leading the investigation of the assassination of John Newman, the Member of Parliament in New South Wales, who was murdered. And we've convicted the main offender. He's been sentenced to life, never to be released. But those who supported him called us all names, and certainly called me names, and made allegations against us. We ended up having and this is, I guess, the point I want to make is that how torturous the process can be. But if you're committed and you want to do good things, you cannot give up. Obviously, you've got to continue. So we had a coroner's inquest. We had hearings in the New South Wales Crime Commission. We had a coronial inquest, as I said, a committal hearing which went for about 3 months, 3 Supreme Court trials. He went to the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Court of Criminal Appeal, and then the High Court of Australia. Out of all of that, he was found to have done it. He's been guilty. But he was granted a Royal Commission of Inquiry into his conviction, which took 9 months. We were all in the witness box for days at a time, trying to explain what we said and did 15 years before, even though it had been through such torturous judicial oversight. At the end, Justice Patton said that he was even more guilty than the jury was allowed to hear, and that we hadn't done anything wrong. And it was a shame, I think, to almost verbatim said that it's a shame that those who made these allegations against the police ran on emotions rather than looking at the facts. Anyway, some people want a Walkley Award, even though it turned out to be all wrong. The point I wanted to make is it's a contact sport, and I accepted that when I went to major crime, because you can't, it's again about bullies and about people who will stand over you to stop you from doing what you need to do, your job, and what you're there to do. I just want to talk a little bit then about my role in some of the overseas stuff that I've done that Gerard mentioned, and it's all in the book as well. So in 2004, I'm Egyptian born and brought up, migrated as a 12-year-old. I spoke English before we came, and French, unfortunately, which I've lost. We came out, with basically not much in our pockets, but we certainly had dreams and a vision for where we wanted to go, and an aspiration to do well. So I joined the police, and I meet a lot of people through my work with the FBI and the US DEA and so on. And some of those people were selected by the Bush administration in the US to go to Iraq after the fall of Saddam, the invasion, and rebuild the Iraqi police and security forces. They contacted me and asked if I was interested, and it took me a little while to agree, but I thought, I wasn't getting on with the hierarchy in New South Wales Police at the time, and I had a particularly cranky boss who used to yell at me at the time. I was the commander of the homicide squad. I do remember saying to him, he said, "What's this Iraq about? What are you applying to go there for?" I took a leave of absence, applied for a leave of absence for 12 months. I said, I thought I'd go somewhere with a bit less conflict and hostility, but anyway, he didn't laugh. He didn't laugh. But so I was selected by them to go over as a senior police advisor, and then a few months after that I was sort of promoted to be the deputy chief police advisor, rebuilding the Iraqi police. It was a heck of a job, and we did it in a very active conflict zone. There was an insurgency trying to stop everything from happening. There were a lot of people who simply didn't want us to succeed, obviously. That's sort of a 2-hour discussion on itself and what went wrong in Iraq and what went right, but I'll just make this one point. And so many people have said to me over the years, did I go because I agreed with George W. Bush? Did I agree with the US policies? It wasn't any of that. I'm not political at all. I've tried to be absolutely politically neutral in whatever roles I've had. And as I came through the ranks in New South Wales, both sides of politics say, how about it? And I just say, look, I'm not a politician. I'm here to do a job. Please leave me out of all this stuff. But I went because the Iraqi people needed help, and they needed to stand up again and to democratise and modernise everything they were doing, because they had fallen badly behind, obviously, under the Saddam regime. So I'm happy to have done that. It was unusual, and I now know the Australian War Memorial interviewed me for a series that they're putting together of oral history. I now know I'm the only serving Australian police officer to have served with the coalition in Iraq. Others may have come and gone in a week or two, but I certainly spent most of that year there, 2004, and then went back twice more. Firstly, because there were allegations that Australians had been kidnapped, and I went to help with the investigation of that. And then the third time I went back within 2005 was again at the request of our federal government to help them establish the Iraqi Special Tribunal, which did regime crimes and Saddam's trials and so on. Just a word on that. And I think the thinking in Canberra, our capital, our federal government, was that Saddam had 12 or 13 major cases against him. And when I came back, I was asked to debrief in Canberra, and my view was that they will try him on the first one, they will find him guilty, he'll appeal, he'll lose, and they'll kill him. They'll execute him. And people, just simply didn't believe me. They just said, no, there's 12 cases. They're going to have to hear most of them. People need closure. The international community will insist. Guess what happened? They tried him on the first one. He was found guilty. He appealed, he lost, and they executed him. And I think it was, the 35 years of oppression and a really bad dictatorship obviously came to the fore, and there was a whole lot of revenge that went on. So I came back, and I got promoted to deputy commissioner before I left, and I got married, and a few other things happened. But I was then selected by the United Nations to head up the Special Tribunal for Lebanon investigations into the assassination of the Lebanese Prime Minister, Hariri, as Gerard said, but also there were about 20 other murders that had occurred over a 4-year period between 2004 and 2008. Mainly politicians, journalists, military men and police. The state of Lebanon passed legislation. They didn't feel they could investigate it because the suspects were Hezbollah, who are a military force in the country, a militia, and they're also in parliament, and they have a political party and so on. And they just didn't feel they could do it. And I think what convinced them also they couldn't do it is the last assassination that occurred a few months before I came in is a fellow that would have been one of my deputies in the investigation. He was a Lebanese police officer called Wissam Eid. And he was the first one to analyse communications. So he worked out the suspects, where their phones were and so on. I'll summarise it. Essentially, and we took it to a whole other level after I came in, obviously, but essentially the bad guys, which were Hezbollah, we indicted 5 guys from Hezbollah in the end, and I'll get to the result in a minute. They went to so there's the Sunnis and the Shiites in Lebanon and most of the Middle East. It's like the Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland. It's actually very, very, very parallel. The Hezbollah and the regime at the time in Syria and Iran are all Shiites, and they do, stick together. And Bob Baer, in fact, the fellow I mentioned earlier, gave expert evidence for us, made a statement in relation to how the 3 of them act in unison, and they never do anything against each other and so on. But what Wissam Eid began to prove with the communications analysis is that the bad guys who were Hezbollah, so they were Shiites, went to a very Sunni area, Tripoli in the north of Lebanon, 2 hours north of Beirut, and they purchased the mobile phones, the SIM cards, the suicide vehicle and so on, and they activated those mobile phones on and off for about 6 months in this Sunni area. They also got a patsy, a young fellow called Ahmed Abu Addas, who was a Palestinian Sunni guy, and they got him to make a video, a martyrdom video, to say, I'm doing this in the name of Osama bin Laden and the Sunnis and so on. It was the exact opposite of the truth. He disappeared, and we're sure they used him to make the video and then executed him. But it was all meant to convince us that the problem was the Sunnis, not Hezbollah. But what we proved is, with the communications analysis, is that the bad guys, and there was 5 of them who were involved in the murder, had their real phone that they used day to day, and the murder phone that they used to coordinate at the time and place of the murder. And we proved that for each of those 5 defendants, the 2 phones moved together for 6 months. And that's when Hezbollah, who have no sense of humour, the head of Hezbollah then gave a number of international speeches singling me out and calling me names and so on. But the point I wanted to make about Lebanon, I just want to acknowledge a great friend here, Sarkis Nassif, a very prominent member of the Lebanese community and a staunch supporter of justice and truth, I have to say. But the point was, with all those murders that had occurred, there was a cult of impunity. People were committing murders knowing that they weren't going to be investigated properly, they were never going to be held to account, and nothing was going to happen. And guess what happened after the tribunal was established? The murders stopped, at least for a while. I think there's been a couple in more recent times, but certainly it's a rapidly evolving environment in Lebanon, and I'm watching closely, as many good people are, and hope and pray. It's such a beautiful country with beautiful people. They've been through so much with the civil war, and everyone has repeatedly invaded and held territory there and so on. But they're so resilient. They just bounce back. I don't know how they do it. Anyway, we indicted 5 guys. 2 are dead, 3 have been convicted. And Hezbollah, I think you'd have to say, out of the current conflict, have been decimated. Their capabilities have been decimated. Their leaders have, and certainly Hassan Nasrallah himself and those who followed him, have been assassinated by Israel. And I make no comment about that. I'm just saying they have been. I would argue that you can't be a democratic country if you have more than one military force. It means someone can force the government or coerce them into doing something or threaten them, which is exactly what Hezbollah were doing. I go back to my first comment about bullies. They are the ultimate bully, in my view. So I was happy that we contributed towards ending that cult of impunity and hopefully, making them think twice before they did committed any more murders. The next role I've had was I was selected by the United Nations after I left the police to lead the investigation into the use of chemical weapons in Syria, which we did. I won't, this is another 2-hour discussion, but certainly it's fair to say that all of the nations and the intelligence communities that you would think of from the West and elsewhere had a finger in that pie, and everybody wanted us to listen to them, and everybody had their view about who did it and what happened and so on, including the Russians and some other Arab countries that are aligned with the Assad regime, which was in power then. We wrote a really good report, I thought, which proved that the Assad regime had used chemical weapons and that nobody else had in Syria. He had used chemical weapons on his own people. There's no doubt about that. The United Nations Security Council tendered the report and so on. They filed it. There were more attacks, and I do recall President Barack Obama saying, if it can be proven that he's done this, it will be a red line and there will be consequences. President Obama said after our report was tendered that he was disappointed. That's it. Nothing happened. There may have been a cursory bombing of a couple of places, but nobody actually held him to account. And he, again, bullies. If you keep doing something and you're getting away with it, you just keep doing it. You're not going to stop. So I was contacted about 6 months later saying, there's been more attacks. We need you to come back and do more investigating. And I said, well, what did you do with my last report? I declined politely. And then the last job I had with the United Nations, obviously, was the Office of Internal Oversight Services. Each big piece of the United Nations has to have an oversight office. So one of the bigger pieces of the United Nations is UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is much maligned at the moment, probably unfairly in many ways. But they do everything to do with the Palestine refugees. After 1948, they were established as a temporary measure for the hundreds of thousands who were homeless and so on. And here we are, 70-odd years later. There's about 5 million plus refugees, about 30,000 staff in 5 countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Gaza and the West Bank. I had 4 departments: investigations, audit, evaluation. The UN very systematically evaluates whether they're getting value for money from whatever they're doing in the refugee space, and an ethics division. The ethics division in the United Nations is a proactive, it exists in many areas of the United Nations. They don't wait for complaints. They go in and check your systems and processes before anything happens, before there's a problem, and to see if everything's going well. So I took that job up, and my wife and I moved to Jordan for about 3.5 years. And it was certainly an experience. I travelled extensively, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Gaza and the West Bank. And, it's just such a fractured region. And, you look at the current conflict, and we'll talk about that, but I wish I had solutions. You're constantly looking for ways to try and get people to see the other point of view, but they're almost incapable of it. All sides are incapable of seeing the other person's point of view, the other side's point of view. Anyway, and then I came back to Australia, did a little bit of consulting work, and then I was selected by Prime Minister Scott Morrison to chair the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. It took me a couple of weeks to agree. I knew it was going to be a bit of a tough one, and it certainly was. We just a few statistics. We did 900 private hearings. That's me or one of the other commissioners, the psych and the person, and they can bring support people with them, their doctor, their mum, their dad, their husband, wife, whatever, telling their stories. They're people who would not give evidence for whatever reason in public. 900 over 3 years. And we'd go to a city, we did every capital city at least a couple of times. You do a week, you do 3 or 4 a day for the week, and you get to the end of the week, and I have to say, I had nothing left. There's nothing in the tank. You'd have to be inhuman not to feel something when you see such dreadful things that have happened to people, such wrongs, if you like, bullying at a rate that's just, atomic, and in many cases never righted. A couple of statistics that illustrate the problem. 80%, we think, up to 80% in any year of veterans and serving members of our Defence Force who suicide have never been to a war. 80% have never been to a war. For some people, it is the blood and the gore and the trauma of conflict zones. But for the majority, it's actually how they treat them. It's what's happening in the barracks. It's the disciplinary system being weaponised against them when they complain. It's your chain of command being horrible to you. It's your workmates doing terrible things to you on boats or whatever. And the other thing is, we identified, we had a team of analysts and they looked at what came before us. It's really important to see what came before us. There's at least 57 inquiries that occurred over 30 years, 770 recommendations before the Royal Commission was established. Guess what? Many, if not most of them, were never actually actioned properly. No one ever actually assessed whether they actually acquitted the intent of those recommendations. 2 of them were actually quite significant Senate inquiries that should have been followed up on. I don't think anyone went back to check, did they actually achieve what was intended? There was some really good work done, and we galvanised all of that. We harnessed it. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. But at the end of the day, all we could do was make recommendations, and we were 58th inquiry that we're aware of, and many veterans who were very angry, quite rightly often, said to us, well, you're just a 58th inquiry, you're not going to achieve anything. So what kept us up at night is, what do we do to ensure that our recommendations are not simply filed like all the others? So the main recommendation was the establishment of an independent body with Royal Commission powers, which is able to report publicly, and they were to assess the implementation of our recommendations and report publicly to Parliament and the public, and to forevermore watch this space and make sure that everything's on track. Our task required us to look at the Five Eyes, US, UK, Canada and New Zealand, as well as Australia, obviously. And we visited all of them and we looked at what they were doing. And Canada and the US in particular had mechanisms in place so that this sort of function of someone who's independently looking at things and reporting publicly to make the public and the media aware, to make Parliament aware and to have people asking them questions. I have to say in the US, and perhaps it's because so many of their politicians have served in the military, there is a lot more awareness. Frankly, they care. Everyone we spoke to in the US said you get called up to Congress often, you get called up to the White House on a very regular basis. I don't know that too many Australian Prime Ministers have actually read those 57 reports, have actually asked questions about what we're doing for veterans, have insisted that things be followed up on. We took an unusual approach. I took an unusual approach. We were told by the lawyers, God love them, I hope I don't offend anyone, that it's unusual for sitting Royal Commissioners to talk to the media. We made a very conscious decision. The only way we were going to get anywhere with solving these problems was to raise the profile of the problems to such a degree that they become undeniable, which is exactly what we did. I gave an address at the National Press Club. Frankly, I dropped a bucket on everyone, and many people weren't happy with me. But at the end of the day, I'm not looking for a job in Canberra, and I don't really care what they thought of me. I just wanted to do what we set out to do. I'm really happy to tell you that in record time, and Prime Minister Albanese stressed that it was in record time, they've accepted 104 out of the 124 recommendations that we made, including the main one, which is the establishment of that body that monitors what's going on and reports and keeps the public. I'll just mention a couple of other things as well. I learned a lot in those 3 years about PTSD, about depression, about all the mental health issues that we all face and all that. I had really bad PTSD when I came back from Iraq. I was at war with the New South Wales Police hierarchy about promotions and so on. It's all in the book. They wouldn't promote me for quite a few years. We have to find a way. It's not just a policing problem. It's not just a military problem. It's a society problem. There is the stigma attached to big heart, tough men and women from the SAS or the police or community generally. It's really hard for them to put their hand up and say, I'm not well, I need your support. I don't need to be judged. I don't need to be put on a corner, have my weapon taken off me and be declared non-operational because nobody knows what to do with me. We have to find a way to try and remove the stigma so that people get help and feel they can put their hand up and say, I'm not well, I need help. I need your support. I don't need to be judged. I don't need to be put in a corner and medically classified as, unusable, if you like. We made a whole bunch of recommendations in that regard and about what happens to people when they put their hand up and so on. But it really became clear to me two things. One, that the problems in policing and emergency services are very similar to the military. And two, that society has a role. Really, all of you good folks here and those watching us at home have a huge role to play. in asking questions, writing letters. The media has a huge role to play as well. I don't think we as a society have paid enough attention. And I think the US is probably the other extreme where, they say, thank you for your service, you don't line up at airports, you get free theatre tickets, movie tickets and so on. I'm not advocating all of that, but I'm just saying there is a culture of respect in the US for the uniform, for those who serve, and making sure that they look after them, particularly when they finish and they're broken. So I'll leave that where it is. I guess there's been a few firsts which I'm proud of. Firstly, I think I was the first person from a non-English speaking background and first generation, in fact, having been born and brought up overseas, to reach the rank of Deputy Commissioner and probably to reach at that level in government, in New South Wales at least. I think I'm probably one of the first, if not the first, to serve as the chair of a federal or national Royal Commission without being a lawyer, let alone a former Supreme Court judge. You laugh, my friend, but I don't know. I just don't know. They never tell you. I now know if you ever get selected and someone rings you and says they want you to do a Royal Commission, you ask, well, how did you come by me? There's someone who recommended me. What happened? You don't know. It's all completely opaque. What they did say to me later on, it's the Federal Attorney General's Department, is that you've been in war zones, but you're not military. So you haven't got an allegiance or an agenda and you're not wedded to the military. So hopefully you'll bring an independent mind. You've run major investigations. This is simply an investigation, which it was. I was blessed. I had two fellow commissioners. One was a former Supreme Court judge from Queensland, James Douglas, and the other one was a psychiatrist and former CEO of the National Mental Health Commission, Dr. Peggy Brown. I think the guys and gals in our office used to start a joke, which they never actually finished, which is a psychiatrist, a cop and a judge walk into a bar. And then, if anyone's got any ideas about how to finish that joke, let me know, because we couldn't think of anything in the end. But I think we brought really different perspectives to the problems, and it actually worked really well. We got the job done, I hope, in that regard. So that was a bit of a first. One of the things we had to do was we went to each of the 8 jurisdictions in Australia, and along the way we interviewed, and sometimes in public, got them to give evidence, the state or territory minister for veteran affairs. In Victoria at that stage, I'm not sure if she's still there, a really, really clever lady, Natalie Solomon, was the Victorian state minister for veteran affairs. So I was really impressed with a lot of the people that we met along the way, but she was very impressive. And she said to me, "I've followed your career." She's Turkish. And she just said to me, forgive the language, but she just basically said, "Look, you're the first WOG to head up a Federal Royal Commission." And I guess it's a bit of a first as well, but I'm happy to have done that. So how am I going for time, Gerard? I'll wrap up.
Getting close to it.
Okay, thank you. I guess what I'd say is that I look back on, and I look rather at the moment about what's happening in the world. There are problems in the Middle East. There's a problem in Ukraine, Sudan, everywhere, really. Yemen. There's so many conflicts everywhere in the world. And there's a lot of doom and gloom. I'm a glass half full type of guy. And I just urge everyone to not be negative, to be positive. And I think our society, I have great faith. I have great faith in our society, our institutions, and the fact that we will get through this. This is a bit of a dark era, and it is really bad. Certainly you wouldn't want to be in some of these places in the Middle East. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. I just don't know how it ends. I can't see how it's going to end, how it will wind up. But the bottom line is, I think you just have to have faith, stay positive, and contribute in whatever way you can. So I'll come to the end. So when I look back on my service, there's probably 3 principles that I've tried to adhere to, and I've tried to express them in the book. Poorly, I'm sure. But leadership is really important. The problems I've looked at in some of these places and the Royal Commission and the issues we identified, it's because of a catastrophic failure of leadership. It's because the 3 principles, I think, there's a difference between being in charge and taking charge. And I think where things have gone wrong, and certainly in the Royal Commission, the issues we found is that there were people with lots of pips on their shoulders and medals on their chest. They were in charge, but they weren't taking charge and making sure that things got done. The second principle I'd say is that you've got to treat others the way you'd like to be treated. When I was Deputy Commissioner of New South Wales Police, and when people got promoted to Superintendent, I used to try and meet with them and talk to them. And I used to say to them, all I'll ask of you is you treat others the way you'd like to be treated. And if I see that not happening, you'll hear from me. And then the third one is that hope is not a plan. I had it up on the wall, and it's been quoted in a few coroners' cases, Kaldas says. But it's, I think for all of us, and whatever it is you do in your daily life, people hope everything will be all right. But if you don't actually have a plan, if you don't actually pick up the cudgel and do what is required to get the job done, it just doesn't happen usually. So they're the three sort of principles. But I look back on those 35 years in police and all the roles I've had overseas. It's almost a decade now of service in various roles since I left the police in the United Nations and internationally. I'm really proud to have served my city, my state and my country in the international space in particular. So ladies and gents, I just want to thank you again, and Gerard and Anne for having me. I'll leave you with this thought. When I look back at the places I've been and the opportunities I've had, the battles I've had, not just with the evildoers, but with bureaucracies, as well as the criminals, but the incredible people I've worked with, I've been blessed to have worked with all of them. And as I said when I left the police, they asked me what I'll miss. And I said, you don't miss the circus, but you miss the clowns. It's really about the people. And the second thing I said is, you know what I regret after all these years? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Thanks, ladies and gents.
So now we come to questions and discussion. As I said earlier, we've got copies of the book Behind the Badge by Nick Kaldas, and he'll be happy to sign copies after when we get to after. So we've got about 20 minutes left. We don't have a lot of time, but we have got time. So I just want to start off. I mean, thanks for a fascinating talk. Okay, you're a pretty tough guy. Now, there's a lot said about Australia now and going back 50 years. I guess you arrived here, you spoke only Arabic.
No, I spoke English and French.
Yeah, but your main language would be Arabic.
Arabic.
Okay. So when people say we're a racist country, what were your experiences as a young boy growing into becoming a young man on the way up? Let's come back here.
I think by and large, I don't agree that Australia is a racist country per se, but there are issues of racism, and I certainly felt some of that, sometimes from within the police, but often from the community. You might go to a job and then the WOG thing comes out, because that's what they have to whack you over the head. I don't think anyone's perfect, and I don't think Australia's perfect, but we are far, and I've had occasion to live and travel and work in many countries, Western and Middle Eastern. We're blessed. We are way ahead of many countries that have deep, really deep structural problems. I look at what's happening in the US at the moment, regardless of what you think, and I'm not being political at all, but they are so divided. There is such a deep division, and race issues always come into it. I think we need to recognise how well we're doing, and value that and defend it as best as we can.
Nick, your time in Iraq sounds very interesting. We don't hear much about it anymore, but you obviously must still follow what's happening there. How has it gone, and do you think what you did there is contributing positively to the future for it?
I hope so. Thanks for that question. It has stabilised in many ways. There is a dormant or very small insurgency which has just about been knocked out, ISIS and the like, but by and large the central government is in charge. They've worked out most of their internal sort of problems, the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds. I thought that was complicated because they are very diverse and they're all rubbing up against each other. Until I got to Lebanon, there's 17 different sects. And on any given day, it was impossible to predict who was siding with who. But I think, to answer your question, I do follow it, and I still have friends there, Western and Iraqis, but they're back on track. Iraq at the time, so I was there in 2004, they had the second or third largest oil reserves in the world. They've got two river systems in a region that's very dry, the Tigris and the Euphrates. They have incredible historical sites, Babylonian and others there. They could really do a lot with tourism if they get their act together and make it safe for people. I think the future's bright for them. They're just got to get their act together and stop fighting with each other. Yeah.
Nick, I thought you really hit the nail on the head when you're talking about Sunni and Shia problems really through the whole area there, and the solidarity of the individuals within the separate groups. It comes down to culture, it seems to me. I've never quite understood why it started. But do you have any other comment to make on how it comes to an end? Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. How it started is another 2-hour conversation, which I'm happy to have offline. But very, very briefly, and it is important, I think. You know, I was a hostage negotiator for many years. It's in the book, but what they tell you is that if you can understand why someone's doing what they're doing, most often it's not bizarre. There's actually a rationale to it. But you've got to make the time to understand where the heck they're coming from and how they got to this situation you're in. The Prophet Muhammad in the Muslim faith, I'm Christian, we're Coptic Orthodox, but I lived and was brought up in the Middle East, obviously, and I've served there in many roles. The Prophet Muhammad died without leaving a clear successor. It was really a war of succession. And those who supported his cousin, who had also married his daughter, Ali, were called Shi'at al-Ali, or the followers of Ali, and that's where the word Shi'at comes from. They felt they had a strong claim on the throne, if you like, the caliphate. He was the cousin of the Prophet, and his kids were the grandkids of the Prophet Muhammad. I don't think anyone had a stronger bloodline claim, and yet they lost out in the end. The Shiites, to cut it short, they were massacred, and they didn't gain control of the faith, if you like. The Sunnis, which were the majority, were against them, and ever since then, the two have just been against each other. As to where we're at the moment, you've hit, again, I think you've hit the nail on the head as well. My view is that apart from the Palestine-Israel conflict, everything else that's happening in the Middle East at the moment is all about the Sunni-Shia divide. In Yemen, even in Lebanon sometimes, if there are issues, in Iraq certainly, and in Syria, it was all about that. And then you get the proxy issues. So Iran is like the godfather of the godmother of the Shiites, and Saudi Arabia is the supporter and godmother of the Sunnis. And they're proxy wars. They're feeding weapons and egging on their proxies, those they support, to further their cause. And, you know, I think I learned one thing in Lebanon, the Middle East, and particularly Lebanon and Beirut, beautiful as it is. It's one of those places that's quite sort of exotic, but all these countries have their spies and whatever, you know, loitering in the bars and hotels and what have you. Everyone wants to do their dirty work there instead of doing it in their own backyard. It's a bit James Bondish, but yeah. If you haven't been to Lebanon, I strongly recommend it. I think most of the time it's quite safe. Maybe just wait a couple of months at the moment, but I'm sure it'll get back to normal soon.
Thanks, Nick, for your service on behalf of the citizens of New South Wales, because I'm sure
Thank
it's
you.
a most difficult job. On the Fung No case, Meredith Bergman and her supporters, how were they so gullible to believe that Fung No was innocent, and what was their reaction after Justice Patterson's verdict?
How can I put this? Look, we Four Corners did the program which started it all, and then the Herald and others ran with it and whatever. But thank you for that. We all feel, and certainly all those judicial processes that I've just gone through proved beyond any doubt, that he actually did it. There's no doubt about it. There is no alternative theory. There's no one else. It's him. I don't know, and I think at one stage it was sort of painted, not by Meredith Bergman, but by others, as a sort of racist conspiracy against a migrant or whatever. The irony of it is you have an Arab who migrated here as a kid leading the investigation, and the prosecutor is Mark Tedeschi, Jewish Italian, who also was not here, hasn't been here all that long. So, I mean, this issue of it being somebody picking on him because of race, it wasn't that at all. It was because he did it. There is a move afoot at the moment, I understand, another campaign saying, I don't know how many inquiries you have to have. I guess if you jump up and down loud enough and often enough, sometimes you get what you want, even if you don't deserve it. Yeah. Yes.
Hello, Nick. Yeah. A comment and then a question. Initially, you made some comment about having looked at the previous list of speakers here. You didn't know whether you measured up. With respect, absolute nonsense. And the question is, you're Egyptian originally, and you often parents Egyptian. You spent a lot of critical time in the Middle East in very responsible positions. The fact that you had that original upbringing, did that help you in any of the decision making and knowing of the whole area, etc.?
Yeah, certainly. And it did play a big part in my makeup and what I've done in my life, my faith, We're Coptic Orthodox or Christians. My brother's a priest in our church. He gave up medicine and went into the priesthood. The culture of serving, of actually helping others, is big in our community. There are groups like Coptic Orphans and many other charity groups that I'm happy to support. There's a lot of poverty and a lot of sadness in the Middle East, but certainly in Egypt. It has formed a big part of who I am and how I got here. And you'll see in the book, I think probably the single figure who's influenced me the most is my father. My father used to use a weightlifter. And till the day he died, he had arms like legs and he never took any crap from anyone. But he was also a very fair man. If he saw something that he just thought, this isn't right, he was never going to turn a blind eye or walk away. And I hope I've picked up on that. Yeah.
I've got a question from one of our Zoomers. It says, would your speaker like to comment on his role in counter-terrorism in New South Wales and the period where there were conspiracies to commit terrorism crimes?
I was hoping no one would ask that, but look, I think anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is unacceptable. And I think in terms of politicians and the communities generally, saying what you would want them to say, this is unacceptable, and those who may be on one side or the other saying, not in our name, it has to stop. I think it's really important. I think that's happening. It is happening. There's so many people from all sides who are saying this can't happen. It's not going to happen. But you will always get a fringe, and you will always get a fringe which may be dramatically affected by whatever's happening overseas. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, there were issues in Northern Ireland and there were people in Sydney and New York and Boston who felt very strongly and were fundraising and sending weapons and all that sort of stuff. You want to help your kin. So for one side or the other, all I've asked, and I've been fortunate, I chair the board of Multicultural New South Wales, the advisory board, and we've been giving government and the public a plethora of advice and commentary about what's happening and trying to put people's minds at rest. But I think whether it's politicians or others in the community who say things and inflame the situation should really need, step back and think long and hard. Will this achieve what I would want to achieve? And the answer is no. That actually, by upsetting people and inflaming the situation and raising the temperature, it's actually going to be against what you want to achieve. So I said it earlier, Gerard, I think we really need to value what we've got here because it's very, very special, and we shouldn't destroy that just because of something that's happening overseas.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for your talk. Talking about the problems in the ranks of our forces, services, whatever, and the police. We've been talking about this for a very long time, and we don't have our Army, Navy, Air Force, whatever we call it these days, doesn't even take part in wars like generations that I grew up with, certainly my parents' generation. Tell us what the real problem is. I mean, you talk about leadership, yeah, that's fine, but there must be specifics. So we've got a problem recruiting people for the services right now.
Yep, they have.
Which feeds into that sort of thing. So give us a little idea of what
Sure.
you were saying in your reports and what the specifics of the problems are.
Okay. Culture. You could sum it up in one word, it's culture. Both for the serving community, but then later on when you resign or retire or whatever and leave, and then the responsibility of looking after you moves to the Department of Veteran Affairs. I'll start at the beginning. We studied basically a whole of life, if you like. So selection, recruitment, what happens at recruitment, whether they're told things accurately or not, and the suggestion is that they haven't. They've been promised things that simply aren't realistic. And then the training programs themselves, and so many people get injured in those training programs with unrealistic, the backpack with 20 kilos of bricks. I'm not sure what that does. Anyway, there's medical evidence to say that a lot of things they do to people in training are not actually all that productive and so on. But people get injured, and when you're injured, they call them linger. It's actually the offence of malingering is in the Defence Act. It's in the legislation. You can punish people if they, and then that's what you get. I've broken my leg. It's not that bad. You're malingering. And then you get treated badly by those around you because others have to do the work that you can't do, and the hierarchy's upset with you, and so on. So that happens. And then there's the issues with deployment. Again, we've said it as accurately as we can in our report. My view is that Australia relied too heavily and too strongly on special forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think history has borne that out. And it was with the best intentions on everyone's part. But there's only a few hundred of them out of the 60-odd thousand in the Australian Defence Force, and they were flogged. Some of them did 15, 16, 17 tours of duty. They'll never say no. You're wanted, you're up, but your family, no, I'll never say no, I'll go. To expect them to have come back after that sort of torturous tours of duty and not be impacted was unrealistic, and we didn't do enough for them when we got back in re-assimilation and so on. And then there's the issues with the exit, the resignation or the retirement. And, you know, one of the things we looked at in the UK is their Department of Veteran Affairs is within their Department of Defence. They use the same computer systems. We've got two different departments here, and they don't talk to each other. So people have trouble getting their own records to prove where they've been and what's happened to them and so on. It could take years to get claims approved. There's up to 62,000 claims were outstanding when we started. It's down to next to nothing now. It was a bit of a perfect storm. The Abbott government had a view, and I'm not being political at all, that the bureaucracy in Canberra is bloated, and they, across the board, cut numbers and capped them. But what it meant for the veteran community, as at a time when veterans were coming back in large numbers from Afghanistan, Iraq, even going back to other conflicts that we'd had prior to that. We heard from everyone going back to the Vietnam War. We didn't see anyone from Korea, the Korean conflict. But the bottom line is, we simply the country and the governments of the day did not do anywhere near enough to make sure that when people came out of the military, they were looked after properly. They were treated very badly. There's some really, really terrible things that people were knocked back for and put through hell. If you add all of those things up, from when you were selected, how you were treated at training, the deployments that they've made you do, and then what they did when you were leaving and you should have been able to get all your entitlements relatively easily and so on. One other problem that we identified, and it's a really good question, Anne, about, because I wasn't specific about what the problems were. What we saw in other countries in the Five Eyes is that their ex-service organisations, and there's a whole sector there, is probably more effective than what we've got here. I'm not saying they're fractured here, but I mean, some of them are suing each other and what have you. You've got the RSL, we commissioned some research. Australian Catholic University did the research for us. There's up to 3-something thousand organisations. Some of them are unit organisations. They don't get any government funding. They don't provide any services. They're just a bunch of guys and gals who want to get together once a year and remember and just reminisce and so on. No problem with that at all. But we were looking for solutions, and the best, just to give you an example of some of the solutions we came back with. So the Americans inspired us with the established body that monitors what's going on. They have a panel of experts in America, Act of Congress, can't be delayed or altered. The report has to go to Congress, all of that. The UK have a group called COPSIO, the Confederation of British Serving and Ex-Serving Organisations, headed up by a fellow called General Sir Nick Pope, probably one of the most impressive individuals I'd had the pleasure of meeting. That group is a true umbrella group. The Legion in the UK is the equivalent of RSL. They're not the peak body. They're a member of COPSIO, like everybody else, and here it would be the RSL would be a member, although a major one, obviously simply on numbers and so on. That body doesn't accept any government funding, doesn't get involved in providing services. It coordinates. They insist on two things: collaboration and accountability. They help you come in. If you want to set up, you can't call yourself an ex-veterans group or a veterans group or ex-serving members group unless you actually get accredited by them. And they come in and help you set it up properly, so you have governance, and then you have the collaboration. They direct traffic. There's too many of you doing this. Some of you need to move here. There's no one doing this. There's a gap. You two can move over here. And it just seems to work so much better. We've put them in touch. The ex-service organisations, we held 3 meetings with them. The RSL and Greg Mellick, who's the national president, actually facilitated that, which we're grateful for. There was a lot of conflict in the room. By the time we got to the 3rd meeting, and they had actually made contact with the English and looked at what they were doing, they've all shifted their thinking. They've accepted that they need a peak body, which they will all be a part of. But they sort of wanted us. They wanted the Royal Commission to invent it for them. I didn't think that was right. They need to do it for themselves. They need to live with it. They need to build it, and they need to make sure it works. Frankly, we could have gone for 10 years. There's so many issues. This was one that we felt we handed off nicely to them. They've embraced it. They've got a working group now. They've got seed funding. They've brought in consultants to work out how it's going to be set up. And hopefully they will do a lot more good for people. They just weren't as effective as they could have been. So that's some of the problems.
I've got a Zoom question here, but it'd have to be brief. And the second last question says that it's just been listening to you and makes the point that you've made these references to people doing 16 combat duties services in Afghanistan, but you also made the point earlier that 80% of the suicides were people who have never been to war. So it would seem that the people who were at war are handling it better than those who weren't at war. So what's the problem there?
The issue is some of those people who have been to war did not suicide, but they had physical or mental injuries. And they were not adequately looked after when they got back. It didn't lead to suicide, but it's certainly a problem we identified. So it wasn't at the top end of the range. The problems that we saw were, I won't say easily fixable, but they should have been identified and they should have been sorted out of those 57 reports that came before us. I think there just hasn't been enough interest from governments of the day, sometimes from the leadership of the Australian Defence Force, and more often than not from the media and the public. There weren't enough questions being asked and there weren't enough people insisting that these issues be fixed.
So final question, if you come back in a year's time, will you have another book? Are you going to become a novelist? I mean, what's your career look like? Short stories, perhaps?
I don't really know what I want to do when I grow up, but I have a few things happening at the moment. I'm not sure where I'll end up, but I hope whatever I do is helpful. And I'm reminded of what Don Bradman, Australia's most famous and best cricketer, said when he retired, which they asked him, what's your message when you're retiring to current players? And he said that players have a sacred duty to leave the game in better shape than when they found it. And I think that should apply across the board in government and the private sector. You do good things and hopefully you leave things in better shape than when you found them. I'm not sure if I have, but we've done our best. Thanks.
Well, Nick Kaldas, you certainly done a great job tonight. So well done, and we'll love to have you back sometime. Thank you.